The show that we're doing right now for MTV, we're doing a series on different things that have influenced rock and roll music, and we're doing an hour show right now on progressive rock. First of all, it might take us an hour to try to define what progressive rock is. No one seems to have been able to. Do you have a definition for it?
Well, I would say that the general definition, and it's not mine, but I would presume that people would accept this definition. Progressive rock is anything that doesn't sound like regular rock. Regular rock is everything that sounds like itself. All songs which sound the same. Everything on MTV, everything on the radio, that's rock. Progressive rock is stuff that doesn't sound like that.
You had the honor of being featured by Frank Zappa on one of the greatest early jazz rock albums of all time, which is obviously the album where you played his compositions. Can you tell us a little bit about what you remember about that album? Because what you're saying about, long form compositions, the music for violin and low budget orchestras is a very challenging piece and quite an incredible achievement for jazz violin in 69, 70.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's Richard Bach, the record producer, owner of that label I was signed to, World Pacific, who, after I had recorded Electric Connection and Live with George Duke, he suggested I do a collaboration with a rock or pop musician. And he mentioned Frank Zappa. I knew a bit of Zappa's music, and that was the most intriguing to me. I said, I don't know what can come out musically of such collaboration, but I'm open to the experience. And Zappa, therefore, Richard Bach played my music to Zappa. I didn't know him personally, but we got a meeting like at midnight, 2 days after Richard Bach suggested we do that project. And Zappa liked my playing immediately and accepted to arrange his music for a jazz instrumental album somehow. But I must say that that experience opened my mind, and because he was so daring, Frank Zappa, he didn't care about fitting in any. Oh, sorry. He didn't mind fitting in any category, music category, and that example was important to me because it. What is it? Are you okay? Sorry, you have some editing to do.
Oh, I won't. I'll leave it all in as long as we don't see any faces. It's lovely to see what's going on. You're a very busy man, and it's lovely to see you giving your time over to chat to me. I'm very proud. So no problem whatsoever.
So when 2 weeks after we met Frank Zappa, we were in the studio. He was ready with his arrangements and orchestrations. And I felt at ease because the concept was really instrumental music. And I insisted to have George Duke with me because Frank was responsible for hiring the whole band and choose the musicians he wanted for that project. And so I said, okay, but I want George Duke with me. And so to have George, and also Zappa at the time was hiring musicians who were session musicians in Los Angeles, who could play any style of music, but many were coming from the jazz world. They were jazz musicians. So there was an affinity from as soon as we started playing in the studio, I had no problem at all, except it still went beyond what I was doing at the time because Frank was very admirative of some classical modern composers, and so he wrote a piece for. He felt it was an opportunity to write a piece, a bit like a concerto for me. But since the label couldn't pay, I didn't have the budget to pay for a full orchestra. He just picked up the 3-4 instruments like bassoon, I think.
It's wonderfully arranged because your violin features, but you know, there's great big soloing sections, but there's also very beautiful, quite minimal counterpoint almost as you weave in with other instrumentalists, and it gives you that sort of a cinematic orchestral feel. But at the same time, you know, he arranges it brilliantly for the musicians he had. It sounds a lot bigger than it actually is. In
Yeah,
my mind, there's an orchestra on it, you know.
right. Yeah. So that was a step in my musical life where I understood that I could do the same and not care about writing music that would fit specifically in a jazz category or pop or whatever. Just let the inspiration come, and that's how I started doing it as well. So.
But those two albums, that and Hot Rats, which of course you were involved with, they're seminal albums. I mean, they're actually changing the nature of instrumental music, almost like busting it out of jazz, isn't it? Those are two albums far more than, I mean, people go on about In a Silent Way and certain albums like that, but I feel they're the two key albums for me. And also establishing the violin as being a jazz rock instrument, which it does become. So it's an incredible achievement. What was Frank like as a person?
Well, he was with me. He was very nice. He was very respectful, and we had a good relationship. I felt he was really incredible as a composer, his ideas, yeah. And so I was impressed by his talent as a composer mostly. And but he could be very hard with the guys in his band, very hard. He could be very demanding.
But not to you.
Not to me, no.
No, you're too good.
Well, in fact, it's funny because when then he asked me to join the band to tour with the Mothers of Invention in '73. George Duke was on keyboards, and the rhythm section guys were had a jazz background as well. So when I would take a solo, I must say I was also I don't know. I don't know the term. I don't know what to say. But
Well, it's an incredible band, but I always felt that you were a little bit underused in Zappa's band when you joined the band. To have someone of your, you know, stature or musical mind, you know, I'm a big Zappa fan, and that's an incredible band. But you know, I was a big fan of yours, and I'm a big fan of Zappa, so I would go and get these albums expecting to see you on there. And there's some incredible solos every now and then, but you know, how much were you playing on those gigs? I mean, there's obviously quite complex parts, I suppose.
yeah, well, he was when he started his band with me, George Duke and Tom Fowler and Ralph Humphrey on drums. We all had the classical background. George Duke as well. He studied in a conservatory, and so we could really. Zappa was happy because I think it was the first band that could play his complex instrumental music inspired by classical composers. And so we could do that and read his music, but also play the blues and
Yeah.
the modern style of music. So at the beginning of the tour, the first month, we had a lot of instrumental pieces, and I had several solos. But the thing is, because the other guys in the band were also had a jazz background like me, when I would take a solo, they would follow me, and suddenly it would not be Zappa's band anymore.
Yeah, this is what I thought. Yes, you've explained it.
Leading the guys into the jazz world suddenly, you know. And so after a while, you know, it's funny because Zappa was recording every show, and we were listening in his room at the hotel one night, and he said, he didn't dare say it directly to me, but he said, there are some guys who take the music somewhere else. And so I got it, and I understood that in those days, when I was young like that, I did not really adapt to the other people's music. I just played what I felt and what my style was about at the time. With the years going on, lately, when I have done collaborations, I adapt more to the music I'm playing, you know. But in those days, that was the case. So also, his audience was coming mostly for the satire, the lyric. And so I could feel myself that they were getting a bit lost with that much instrumental music. And so he started cutting down, and to a point where I only had one solo a night, and the rest of the time I would play background. So as much as I was, I respected Frank's really being a genius as a composer, I wanted to do more with my violin than just that. So I left. That's why I left the band.
Next to my penguin, not in bondage.
Oh my goodness!
Look at
Wow.
that. To
sorry,
Andrew, Frank Zappa.
Wow, when did you get that?
I wrote to him when I was probably when I was about 20. I wrote to him, just, you know, I got the Barking Pumpkin advert and address, just wrote to him. They didn't think I'd get anything back, so it was my birthday. I was a massive fan, blah blah blah, and he sent me to Andrew, and I had a little badge. I lost it. He'd put happy birthday on a little badge and sent me a little badge with happy birthday written on it, like a sticker.
Oh, that's lovely. What a lovely thing to have.
So I assume you're a big Zappa fan as well?
Oh, huge. Absolutely huge. I discovered him when I was 15. It was one of those no going back moments, really. Yeah, no, I absolutely love him. But I got into him through the years before it came out anyway. It was 1985, and my then brother-in-law had recorded on a Betamax a gig, which was Halloween 1981, which has since been released. I think it's called The Torture Never Stops now, the DVD that you can get of it. But
that's the one with very young Steve Vai on there with the sort of leopard skin.
Right.
Yeah, I know it well.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's where it started for me.
But there's 3 albums I want to ask you about. So the first is the El Shankar album that you did in 1979, because basically that's a Frank Zappa album. So I can remember when we did the clinic tour and I was asking you about all the work you'd done, and you turned around and said, well, when I worked with Frank Zappa, and I had the gall to turn around to you and said, you never played for Frank Zappa. And you go, I did. It was a classic. But yeah, you've played on a Frank Zappa album. So what was it like working with Mr. Zappa?
Very interesting. Now, I was a huge Frank Zappa fan at that time. I mean, I still am, you know.
Yeah.
And I got a call. They were already in rehearsals. I actually don't know who the first drummer was, but they were in rehearsals, and I guess Frank had fired that guy, and somebody recommended me. Now, I knew Shankar. I'd met El Shankar in New York with John McLaughlin in 1977.
Oh, really?
It was, yeah, we were, because I was playing with Jack Bruce at the time. So I had already met him, but our paths didn't cross musically until doing that record. And somebody called me and said, can you come down to this rehearsal studio today? Yeah, kind of now. I went, oh, okay, I think I can, yeah. So I turned up with my Ludwig Octopus, which by that time I was using on everything. So I was actually using a single-headed kit. It wasn't, I always preferred double head drums, but in those days, you only had so many sizes in double head. This had from 6 to 16 plus a floor tone.
I can remember that. Yeah.
I love the musicality of it,
Yeah.
you know. So turned up with that, and the first tune was that opening song called Darlene. And I was presented with a chart by Frank, and I went, great, okay, now. okay. And I put it up. Then, you know, all I did was there's no way I could have sight read that chart with all the meter changes. So what I did was I just took notice of because every other bar had a different meter. So I just clocked the meter and just played a phrase that I knew worked in 7, knew worked in 9. I stole all from all the records I'd heard, you know. So if you listen to it carefully, you'll get a bit of Birds of Fire on there. I mean, you'll get a bit of everything. It was the only way to get through that chart in one go. And apart from one area, which was so complex, I think I just kind of fumbled and way through it. And Frank was happy and said, "Okay, great." And then we started rehearsing with all the other stuff. It was interesting. He has had a very strange attitude towards musicians. Well, not a lot of respect there.
A little bit like Alfred Hitchcock with actors,
Pro-
which he described as
Quite,
cattle.
yeah, quite possibly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he really didn't. He was kind of tough there. Um, but one thing I did notice, so this song was really difficult, and the musicians that had been hired would not be what I would have chosen to play that music, because then I don't think they would probably admit it. Mackay, bass player, not Duncan Mackay. Damn, I can't remember his name. I mean, he's a good player. He played a lot of jazz. The guitarist was Phil. Played with Dire Straits. Phil. Oh man, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
My
I do this on my channel all the time, so the viewers kind of expect it, you see, and so they're going
yeah.
to put all these people in the comments, thus boosting the algorithm. So now I deliberately not forget, not remember
Ah.
people's names. So don't worry about that. It'll all be
Well,
there. Yeah.
my apologies to Phil. Phil. No, it wasn't Phil James. Phil, a beautiful guitar player.
Yeah.
First played with him with Chris Farlow in 1975. But he is not a jazz player and odd meters. So, and Frank picked this up. So, what happened was obviously the drummer, it's easier for the drummer to learn a chart like that. He doesn't have to think about scales,
Mm.
chords, anything like that. He's just got to hit things, in time. Um, so suddenly I'm like, okay, we recorded this track for 2 days. Then Dave Mackay, I think it was Dave Mackay on bass, maybe. He was pretty much down with it. So Frank would come out and go, okay, between on this bar, between this beat and this beat, I want you to play 11 beats between the two shells, like this. What? I said, yeah. And I went, oh, wow. So he kept coming out and tying me up in knots.
Mm.
Basically, so the other musicians could catch up. And with Phil, he crafted this beautiful part, kind of almost ignoring the meter changes, but they work beautifully. And if you listen to that track and you listen to the way that Phil plays, to me, he's the star of that track. It was beautiful, but I mean, it just took a while to figure. And Frank really helped him and was very patient. He wasn't patient with us, because he tried to, and we got to this bit, and I just went like that, and he said, "That was not 11 beats." So I'm like going, "This is what does that mean? Why? That doesn't feel good to me." But at the end of the second day, we had, if you listen to the track, the most relaxed, beautifully played piece of music with some of the most infuriating time meter changes you could even imagine, but very Indian. And it was gorgeous, the track, absolutely gorgeous.
I think
But
I think Frank from reading so many interviews and talking to people. I mean, I did Ralph Humphrey's last interview on the channel, which was
uh,
fascinating, and we I did it with Greg Bendin, and we didn't realize he was only had about a month to go, and
yeah,
so he obviously wanted to really get across his career and
yeah.
explain it all. What an incredible player! That guy could sight read
We
absolutely
see,
anything, but the the
yeah,
th- the thing was, what I felt, chatting to him, is whichever level you were at, Zappa would want you he would just push you beyond it. So the guitarist, he probably clocked and thought, well, I need to get that performance out of them,
yeah, Yeah.
And Simon, he can do this stuff. So I'm gonna, once he's got this nailed right, let's go to the 11 tuplet or whatever you call it. You know, so
It was great. Now, Ralph, of course, was a huge influence on me. I first heard of him with Don Ellis, and I was a huge Don
yes,
Ellis.
and me, electric,
So,
not Electric Bath. That was Bohannon, wasn't it? Who was another incredible drummer.
Steve
Uh,
Bohannon.
yeah, Steve Bohannon. Yeah,
But
incredible.
Ralph was taking over kind of around that time. He did Autumn, that record, and of course Live at Fillmore and Tears of Joy. So Ralph was, I was like, wow. And then of course I heard him on the Frank Zappa Overnight Sensation and Roxy and Elsewhere with Chester. And all those, you know, like I said, I stole from all these guys, you know. And of course, I got to know Ralph moving to LA,
Mm.
which was great. You know, I used to watch him play certain gigs, local gigs around Studio City, Universal City, and yeah, beautiful player, absolutely beautiful player. And again, you know, it's just like all these influences coming in, you know.
And I've been going through your catalogue last night, and I was finding out stuff I didn't know. So on your first album, when you were Ambrosia Slade,
Yeah.
you did a Frank Zappa track.
Yeah.
Why?
Ain't got no heart.
I ain't got no heart. What was that about?
It was from the Mother's Invention Freak Out album. And don't ask me how we got that. It might have been Jim Lee, actually, who got the album. And we were impressed with that particular song. And it was a great stage song. And when we did the first album, believe it or not, was just a recording test for Fontana Records at the time.
Yeah.
And obviously that album is our stage show from the time. Of course, Ain't Got No Heart. It was obviously including that. And the fantastic thing was, we were in London doing a press thing, and Frank Zappa was there.
No way, because I'm a massive Frank Zappa fan.
Yeah, great. And he was so impressed with it, especially with Jim Lee's bass playing.
It's a fantastic version. I think it's better than the Mothers.
That's a great album. We
Game changer.
used to play that album, Freak Out, it was called, the Mothers.
When you were Ambrosia Slade.
Ambrose
Slade. Was
Ambrose is a rice.
It is it. And Zappa seems to be coming out of that. He's emerging. I think if rock and roll hadn't have happened, he would probably been a composer within that realm. But of course, rock and roll happens, and he and I think he's got a different take on it. He suddenly changes. I think it's the influence of Bob Dylan, and now this is another thing that never seems to get mentioned with Zappa, is that he was produced by Tom Wilson, and Tom Wilson had produced Bob Dylan, but was originally a jazz producer.
Yeah.
And so there's a crossover, isn't there, between Dylan's sort of folk experiment, that thing that's sort of, you know, infusing into rock music, but obviously he'd been producing people like Cecil Taylor, which so this idea that Tom Wilson comes in and he signs Zappa, how did that happen? You know, how did he get? I mean, it's exactly the right guy, isn't it, for Zappa to meet?
That's right, yeah. And again, as I mentioned in the book, Zappa cites the Tom Wilson album called Jazz in Transition, which Zappa said he possessed. And there are a compilation of tracks on the album by people like Coltrane, Cecil Taylor. I think Art Blake is on there as well. So Zappa obviously has absorbed all those different influences. I think you're absolutely right in what you say.
I mean, you know, reading your book, I didn't know that I didn't even know there was a Coltrane Cecil Taylor album. And I checked it out, and it's very interesting because they really are pulling each other apart. You know, Cecil Taylor's perhaps more avant-garde than Coltrane. Coltrane hasn't caught up. He's still in that sort of hard bop, post-hard bop world.
That's right.
And so this is fascinating because I think what you've done with this book is actually place Zappa, rather than him seem like some weird anomaly that exists in rock music, it places him in a certain place. And I think the same with Captain Beefheart. Captain Beefheart was also pulling from free jazz, Albert Ayler and Archie Shepp. You could hear that in his playing, you know. Moving forward, when when he starts to the next album, I think that doesn't get discussed is the King Kong album with Jean-Luc Ponty.
Yeah.
Because this is a really odd thing for Zappa to do, you know, to take on. So he's not a musician in his band. He's discovered Jean-Luc Ponty. Jean-Luc Ponty is playing at that point with the Jean-Luc Ponty Experience. Is it with George Duke?
Yeah,
George
right.
Duke he brings those in. Jean-Luc Ponty's pretty cutting edge at that point. What do you think he was trying to achieve with the King Kong album?
Wasn't it the case that that came about via Richard Bock, who was the boss of Pacific Jazz Records, and Richard Bock he'd taken on Jean-Luc Ponty, and he wanted somebody to produce his album, and he heard a lot about Zappa, as he said, actually in jazz circles, and so he brought Zappa in. He went to discuss this at Zappa's house, and it all came together via Richard Bock, who of course was one of the kings of West Coast jazz. He produced Jerry Mulligan, Chet Baker, all those people. This again, it's another clue to Zappa's jazz connections, really. And it all came together. And I think, as you've said, that Jean-Luc Ponty album, it is actually more of a jazz rock album than Hot Rats.
Let's try and nail Zappa's strengths as a composer, and then we'll have a look at the weaknesses, because we are going to be a bit iconoclastic, I think. So, Shannon, you've gone into so much depth. What would you say be Zappa's strengths as a composer?
I think his strengths, one of his strengths is being able to take disparate elements and put them together and, sort of create these compositions that are really intriguing. It's not very easy to do that. If I just want to go back to what you mentioned about the jazz and classical sort of influence there, it's quite interesting because I think it's underestimated how much jazz musicians were influenced by classical music back in the day. I mean, I know Duke Ellington was influenced by, classical composers. Charlie Parker was listening to Edgar Varese and Stravinsky. So you talk about the third stream there, but it's quite interesting how it was already embedded in classical music. Many of the sort of advances in music theory during the 1940s and 50s, harmonic sort of systems in jazz were derived from classical music, as well as perhaps the George Russell's book, the Lydian chromatic concept.
I wanted to bring this up because obviously my knowledge of George Russell's concept isn't full, and I also am very aware that Zappa seemed to prefer the Lydian mode. I don't know if it's too simplistic to say, was Zappa pulling that sound from George Russell's explorations or not?
There was an article written a few years ago by Brett Clement. He's great. He's one of the sort of leading theorists on Frank Zappa, and he was a real influence when I was doing my PhD. And he's done a fantastic job of, analyzing his music, not just his orchestral music, but his the whole oeuvre.
Shannon, can I just jump in and stop? Sorry to interrupt. It's just so the viewers get an idea. Can you tell the audience about your PhD? Because you are a doctor, aren't you?
I am. That's right.
So if I was coming to see you as a doctor, what would your specialism be?
Well, there are many things that I'm interested in, but in terms of the PhD, my PhD was based on the analysis of his orchestral music, essentially. And I chose orchestral pieces that had never been analyzed before, not to my knowledge anyway, really difficult pieces like Bobbin Dacron and Pedro's Dowry, pieces like that. So I wanted
you do have a doctorate in Zappa, don't you?
Yeah, I'm a doctor. I did a PhD on Frank Zappa. I thought if I was going to commit to a PhD, I was going to do it on something that was interesting and that would inform me as a composer too. That's what was really important to me.
If you're on an airplane and there was some sort of medical disaster and someone said, is there a doctor in the house, then if anybody needs to understand, how quintuplets can be nested inside septuplets, you're the man, aren't you?
I'll be able to help out there. Yeah.
Sorry to butt you, but yeah, this is Shannon's expertise really is incredible in this. So sorry to butt in. You probably forgot what you were talking about. But if you want to carry on.
No, I haven't forgotten. No. Thanks for pointing that out. I mean, it's really interesting because Clement had talked about the way Zappa had constructed his sort of modal music. There, as you said, there's a proclivity for the Lydian mode in his music. It's rampant. And he used concepts from George Russell's publication. George Russell's basic premise is that maybe the major scale shouldn't be the mother of all scales. Instead, it should be the Lydian mode, because there is a certain unity in the sound of the Lydian mode. I know I'm going to talk a bit about music theory. I hope I don't alienate anyone. I'm going to try to explain.
Well, I got to be honest. I've been doing such shallow and trite videos on my channel recently that it would be nice to actually flex the academic and do something that people can get their teeth into. So I'm quite happy to go into this, but it's also be aware that some people will be going, what's this Lydian mode they're talking, what they on about? And Jeff, I'd like to bring you in here, because the reason why I think George Russell is so important is because when you look at his emergence, which is sort of early to mid 50s, isn't it? And he brings these ideas, late 40s, is it?
Yeah.
But the popularization of this method, which is really through Miles Davis, isn't he? Because he becomes very interested in this method, and the modal move that Miles does on Kind of Blue, people say has its results. And the thing is that Zappa comes up in that period, and I've always felt that once you get to the 1960s, another idea crops into jazz. As jazz education starts to get a hold, you have the emergence of the chord scale approach, which is normally how, because George Russell's approach wasn't that, was it? It was much more avant-garde in a way, wasn't it? And Zappa's exactly the right age to have received that if he was aware. But if he did, he covered these influences up, didn't he, a little bit? Do you think?
He was very, he didn't like to give things away, that's true. Although I think Brett Clement says that there's no evidence that Zappa was actually aware of George Russell's work. He may have absorbed it unconsciously or brought it out of his own accord. I don't know what you think about that, Shannon.
Yeah, it's possible that, but I mean, I guess there are similarities in the approach and the way it's used, whether he was aware of him or not. I find it quite interesting reading that article because, I mean, just a basic overview or explanation, if you like, of the George Russell's book is that, he saw the Lydian mode as being the kind of scale that had the most tonal gravity, if you like. You can build up stacked fifths, intervals of stacked fifths, using the Lydian mode to more of an extent than you can with a major scale. So, you take, if you start with the note C, you go to a fifth above, you get G, D, A, E, B, F sharp. You have your fifths there. There's a tonal gravity to it. And so Clement is borrowing from this idea, not the whole concept. Obviously, there are certain things that don't work in its application to Zappa's music. But it's the idea that the fifth interval is a strong interval. In fact, Paul Hindemith talked about this in his publication from 1942. It's called The Craft of Musical Composition. And in that book, he talks about the prominence of the fifth. If you have two notes, if you have a C and an F, a perfect fourth, Hindemith didn't see it as a perfect fourth. He said the gravity was the inversion of the perfect fourth. So you have C and F, you have the perfect fourth, you move the C to the top, you get F and C, which is a perfect fifth. And this makes sense because the overtone series, you have your fundamental, the first interval is an octave, the second interval is a perfect fifth. The perfect fifth comes before the perfect fourth, which, that creates that problem, that gravity problem in the major scale. So it makes sense that the perfect fifth should be the strongest interval and that the Lydian mode could potentially be the mother of all scales as opposed to the major scale. I hope that makes sense. Using intervals in chords and melodies was a real concern for Zappa. He spent many years trying to figure out ways to create compositions that would establish some kind of continuity. He talks about weights, measured tensions, and things like that. And it's interesting we're talking about the fifths because let's say the sus2 chord that he uses in his compositions. The sus2 chord is made up of the root, the second, and the fifth degree of the scale. So if you have C major, you've got C, D is the second note, and G is the fifth note. You play those three notes together, you get that classic Zappa sound. The intro to Idiot Bastard Son has that voicing as many other of his compositions do. And the interesting thing is if you reorganize the notes of that sus2 chord, you get stacked fifths. If you take the, if you move them around, so you take the G and you put it on, put the D on top of the G, you get the fifths there, so you get C, G, D, you get the first, the fifth, and then if you put the D on top an octave higher, you get stacked fifths. It's the same with the sus4 chord. So the fifth always seems to permeate, even in his chord Bible later on when he devised these chords. He had a systematic approach to creating chords for the orchestral pieces. One of the salient voicings that you hear in those compositions is a Lydian voicing, and it's made up of a major third, 2/5, a semitone, and 2/5. I talk about this in my video, Zappa's Chord Bible. So if anybody's interested in this and want to investigate more, you can watch that video. But so that's the sum of it, really, in terms of the Lydian mode and trying to create balance in those very difficult compositions.
He was obviously part of the hippie scene, and he hated the hippie scene. He worked with jazz musicians and played jazz and pioneered jazz fusion and jazz, and he hated jazz. He criticised the London Symphony Orchestra because he didn't think they could play, so he criticised that whole system. And what came out of it, every single this, was great music. So when the punk thing came out and you put on Shake Your Booty and I'm So Cute comes on, it's a brilliant piece of music. And you think, well, Zappa's okayed this music that sounds like punk. Once punk came out, he was doing punk all the time. Absolutely all the time. And you think, well, that's musically, and he had a high standard musically.
Yeah.
And I think
he had the opportunity to do a 2-hour show on Radio 1 where he chose the records, and he played I Live in a Car by UK Subs, which was very perceptive because they were the punk band that really were R&B. Like Charlie Harper, his harmonica's fantastic. That's real dirty R&B, Yeah, and Zappa got it.
It's incredible how I feel music's all about integration. And I think, doing my channel, I've sent out beams and I've attracted such a, Billy Cobham, and I've had Narada Michael Walden on, I've had you on, I've had Taylor Swift's producer on. And every time we all sit down, we're all the same. All these people around, they're all going to start talking, Maybe it's about Alice Coltrane. Maybe it's about Eric Dolphy. Maybe it's about.
That's what I discovered when because I always wanted to write for the rock press, and I was so stupid. I mean, if I could go back, I got something in Sounds. I sent them a review of the Angelic Upstarts at the F Club in Leeds, and they printed it. Now, what I should have done is go down to London, walk in the office and say, "Where's my money, you bastards?" They would all be old, fat, worried. I'd been the young punk. They'd be terrified of me. And they'd immediately have given me "Oh, will you go and review this? Will you do that for us?" But I didn't do that. What I did was, because my training was as a student writing essays, was I kept writing reviews and sending them to the newspaper, and then buying the newspaper, and I wouldn't be in and crying, I just didn't know what to do, the right way to do it, because people are, in publishing, and they don't look at the object. They don't look at is the review any good? It's the person, whether the person, they can use them. Can you ask them to go and do something? And will you be friends with me? And, respect me and all that. And I didn't understand that. So I couldn't get into the rock press. And so it was the jazz revival which enabled me, because I wrote a review of Steve Lacy and Richard Cook liked it. And I'd been really into jazz and free jazz for a long time. And suddenly it was fashionable, you know, because of Courtney Pine and Andy Shepherd and the jazz revival of the 80s. And so I got my foot in the door at the Wire. It never gave me any money, you know, to speak of. I was working, after a long period of unemployment, I got a job in information technology. I was trained as a programmer, computing. But it gave you status, you know, and the fact of being in Wire magazine meant, you know, you were somebody, and musicians wanted to talk to you. But my discovery was that when you talk to a musician, and I'd only ever interviewed people who were my heroes. I always refused it if they asked me to interview someone I didn't like or wasn't.
Can I answer this one?
No, but I just want to finish by saying that what I discovered was that whatever the genre, you know, you're interviewing someone who's in, you know, a country singer, you find that they like African music. You know, that once you get musicians,
once you get musicians in a room, it's like the esoteric heart of music.
Yes.
And he's gone now, but the guy that just called me up is a guy called Kevin Gammond, and he's like my mentor.
All right.
And he went to London in the early 60s, and when he was about 16, 17, he got the gig with Jimmy Cliff. And he was playing on the same bill as the Stones and Hendrix. He used to jam with Hendrix. And he eventually formed the band with his best friend. Everyone's calling me up.
How did you get the gig before we go there? How did you get the gig? How did you know? Because obviously you were with Don for a number of years. Right. You know, you do the Soaring album, which is my favorite Don Ellis album. Incredible. You and I was saying to Greg, you know, you're the drummer on Whiplash. You're the original Whiplash drummer.
I am.
which I think people don't realise.
Of course they don't. Yeah.
You know, so we may have to discuss that as well, but we could leave that to so you know, how did you go from Don to Frank?
No, I was with Don on and off for 5 years, and then I decided, okay, it's my time to leave. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, except I wanted to sort of stay in town, maybe start developing a studio career, play with some other people. Which started to happen. And then in 1973, George Duke, who's a good friend of mine from the Bay Area and was in Frank's band at the time, calls me up and says, Frank's looking for a drummer. And he's heard many, many drummers. And maybe you should come down and play. And frankly, I didn't have that much familiarity with Frank's music. Yeah, Hot Rats and a few other things. And I thought, here's some music I need to actually get into more, but I wasn't quite ready yet. But so I went down and I auditioned at his rehearsal studio, full band. This was before Chester, so I was the only drummer.
Yeah.
And the band was George, Jean-Luc Ponty, Bruce, and Walt Fowler, Bruce and Tom Fowler, Ruth Underwood, Ian Underwood, Frank, and Sal Marquez, trumpet player. What a great band.
That's a band.
We rehearsed, and you know, Frank, he put something in front of me that was pretty dark looking, you know, a lot of black. and I somehow managed my way through, you know, half-heartedly, but you know, my feeling was he saw I could read, and certainly I had the potential to learn that. And then we would do some jamming and some odd meters. I'm sure there was a 7 or something else, and probably 45 minutes later, he stopped and basically said, "The band, take a break." Called me down and said, "You want to join the band?" And that was it. So, and I got to say that after Don Ellis, I felt if I wanted this job, I could have it, because Don gave me that confidence and that knowledge that probably no other drummer at the time had to be able to do what I was able to do.
Andy, you really hit it on that. I mean, it's like the prep school for Zappa is Don Ellis.
It is.
I mean, that we're looking at, Greg, we're looking at the influence of Don Ellis in the Zappa band, because for me, I love Zappa, but Zappa's got a spiky, modernist, avant-garde rock sound until you come in. And I went to see my friend, and his wife's a big Zappa fan. I said, I'm interviewing Ralph Humphrey. And she went, oh, my favourite albums. Apostrophe, Overnight Sensation, Roxy and Elsewhere. And they're everybody's favourite Zappa albums. There's a change. There's a change, I think.
It's interesting, you know, I mean, fortunate for me, I was at that time, and you know, people were really starting to listen to Frank, and he was creating more songs and maybe things that might get on the radio, but most of them didn't anyhow. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that period that he was in, and a lot of people call it the golden age, you know, of Zappa, you know.
Well,
But,
it's first time we hear Inca Roads.
yeah, and that went through many different arrangements. The one that ends up on One Size Fits All is the one that I learned before I left the band. So all the material on One Size, I knew all that material, but I left the band at that time. But this is the 50th year of Overnight Sensation, and I talked to Joe Travers the other day, the Vaultmeister, of course. You know, Universal bought, you know, Frank's catalog, and they were smart enough to bring Joe along. So Joe now is a part of that. But he said, you know, we're going to be releasing some of the concerts that were done in Australia in 1973 in honor of the 50th anniversary of Overnight Sensation. So that should be interesting, because now it's Sal Marquez on trumpet, and we don't have much documentation of Sal in that band.
Well, which studio albums is Sal on? A few, right?
Grand Wazoo, is he on Waka
Yeah.
Jawaka? And and
exactly.
if there isn't a Don Ellis influence on those albums, I just don't get it. So, you know, there's two guys making, you know, expansive rock and jazz fusion with a big band with lots of odd time signatures. One's Don Ellis, one's Frank Zappa, and Frank's doing it after Don. So and Sal, you know, is the featured guy, and I think it, you know, the inclusion of Sal also shows that Frank was listening to Miles as well, I think.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, Miles, Frank would kiddingly say, you know, jazz isn't dead, it just smells funny. But he surrounded himself with jazz players because why? They were the only ones that could play his music.
And they were cooler to hang out with, probably, too. They were more
So,
fun
yeah.
to be around for Frank.
Yeah. And of course, George was a huge influence. And you know, Frank was a big influence on George as well. It got George to sing in the band, and George did just such a fantastic job with that. You know, and you know, my experience in the band before Chester was I really I was having a ball playing that music, learning that music, playing it as well as I possibly could. For me, Frank was, I was in his band. I was a sideman. And whatever he wanted me to do, I'll do it, you know. And I became really close with Ruth Underwood. We had a wonderful relationship. Just what a fine instrumentalist she is. And you know, then Ian left the band.
Integral to Frank's work at that time. Ruth Underwood.
Totally, absolutely, yeah.
And an utter virtuoso.
Also,
you know, I mean, when you look at interviews with Ed Mann, and the respect he's got for Ruth, you can see that she was something else, wasn't she?
She was a prodigy at age 6 on the piano.
Sorry to interrupt this show in this rude and annoying way, but I just wanted to tell you about a few ways that you can support me here on YouTube and get access to even more weirder and wackier content. First of all, you could become a patron. You could become a free member or a paid up member. I have over 300 extra videos on there, and if you don't even want to become a member, please pop over, because you can access my collections where you can purchase even more weirder and wackier video content. If you want to support me financially with a little tip, buy me some biscuits or maybe some crisps, you could pop over to my PayPal tip jar. I also have a Substack where I have lots of clever, academic and thought out articles where I explain my ideas on art, culture and creativity in a more intelligent way than I do here, plus a whole ton of podcasts. If you want to know what my music sounds like, you can pop over to my Bandcamp. Over there, you'll be able to listen to over 50 albums, and if you want to access them all, you could become a subscriber. And last but not least, if you want to support the wonderful studio where I film these lovely videos, which is actually a charity trying to help people out in the community become more creative, here is the website where you could drop a few pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in your country in there. Thanks for listening, and back to the show.